All right, welcome everyone. My name is Philip Lew, and we're starting our webinar today. The webinar topic today is Inconvenient Truth. SDLC, including Agile, is just one facet of quality when acquiring enterprise systems. We're happy to have Dr. Ying Kwong today from the State of Oregon CIO office. Before we go on, let's just go and talk through our house rules. All the participants are muted. We are going to be recording the webinar, so we'll be sending you the recording link afterwards. And feel free to input your questions into the chat panel, and we'll be glad to answer them during the webinar as well as after the webinar. We'll have a time for a casual question and answer period. Just a little first about PNSQC. This is our pre-conference webinar series, and we are the oldest software quality conference in North America, now in our 36th year. It's hard to believe. We're all volunteer conference, so that makes us quite unique, and we are located every year in Portland, Oregon. So we don't change locations. We have a great range of topics and speakers. Today we happen to have Ying Kwong. He's going to be talking about acquiring systems in large enterprises, but we've also had Jason Arbin talk about artificial intelligence, and Michael Ma discuss agile team size and things like that. So we have a really wide range of topics. And first, a little bit about myself before we move on to the star of the show today. Myself, I'm a board member and also the program chair this year. I also run a company called XBOsoft, and the thing I like to talk about most, but we don't have time today, is cycling and travel. So let's go on to Dr. Kwong. I met Dr. Kwong earlier last year, at PNSQC, and we really had some great conversations about Agile and where it fails and where it is successful, and that led to me going down to Salem and working and holding a panel discussion with Ying and some of his coworkers down there, and we had a great time discussing quality and things that we could do to improve it in the state of Oregon and all of their IT projects. But I'll just let Ying do his thing now, and why don't you go ahead, Ying? Great to have you here, by the way.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction, and my own personal involvement with the conference over the years, both as a speaker but also as an attendee. I attended quite a number of PNSQC over the years, and always find the events to be very productive use of time, as well as the ability to network and interact with other colleagues, both in the private and the public sector. So a bit of a disclaimer about the talk and some of the promotional material that might have been shared. Just to set the record straight, I'm not in any way saying that Agile and other iterative development methodologies are not very good idea and important to doing a good job in delivering enterprise systems. In fact, I think the ability to do work iteratively and coupling tightly with the folks involved to create a self-organized team, these are very much factors for success. So let me set the record straight by saying that I think there are lots of good things about iterative development methodology, including Agile. But the message that will be sent loud and clear is that development methodology is really just one facet of success in delivering enterprise system. I hope this slide is not going to end up being controversial in the sense that I think there are certain sweet spots for Agile. These include, for example, when requirements are not very stable, that there's high degree of product novelty. There may be a short time frame for something to be delivered that works. And then, large amount of engagement with stakeholders and the user community, as well as, some of these things that may well be viewed as challenges for Agile, such as the ability for relatively small teams to engage in a co-located environment, and then having the necessary process and tools to actually support the use of Agile in a large, complex enterprise. So let me start by talking about the meaning or the context of a major IT project in typical large, complex enterprises. Government is an example, but I myself has worked in the past in the Fortune 500 companies with different product divisions, lines of businesses. These are among the type of organizations I consider complex. And as a result, when such an organization attempts to acquire major software systems, there's a lot of complexity and challenges that go with it. And a fundamental challenge, in my opinion, is that when you outsource work, which increasingly these days folks would have to do because there's no internal resources to develop software, nor is it necessarily the core competence of an organization. In the process of acquiring software, you're working with a contractor, and the contractors, of course, are driven by the profit motive. The organization, of course, is primarily driven by whether the resultant software can be delivered on time, on budget, and then meet business needs. I believe this set up a fundamental difference in perspective. And I think Agile, whereas is useful, the idea of a self-organized team with the developing organization and the acquiring organization working very closely amounts to a bit of a idealism or ideology. When that happens, that's great. But, like the old saying go, you hope for the best, but plan for the worst. That's kind of the theme of this talk. So major IT projects by nature for a large organization is an investment. And like any investment, it should have a business case. Such a business case typically would spell out major changes in business model or operating paradigm. Increasingly, IT projects are being used to drive organizational change. And by change, we mean sometimes pretty big change along the line of business models or basic approach of operating. So a business case should spell out the business drivers, kind of the reason you want to do that, and the high-level business requirements. Now, on the basis of these requirements and strategic orientations, if you may, different solution approaches will likely be considered. These different solution approaches needs to be rated and assessed against each other based on the relative cost, benefit, and risks. And typically, a specific solution approach is selected, and then the key success factors are identified, and the organization try to move ahead to do it that way. When it comes to available solution approaches, it's very important to differentiate what a large organization would likely be doing versus kind of the mindset of the developing organization, which is in the business of developing software. For large enterprises, a lot of time, a major IT project is built around a base system. By a base system, we mean a commercial off-the-shelf system. These might be ERP systems. In government, that may be like a licensing systems, things that are intended as a software product offering by a specific company for a specific vertical industry need. A second type of base system would be a transfer system. By a transfer system, we mean a similar organization that has already successfully deployed a system, and you take that system as a base, and then you customize it for the needs of the target organization. As a result of doing software system by building around a base system, what turned out to be of great importance in assessing project complexity would be the gap analysis around your base system versus where you want to end up. And this has two dimensions. One is the technical feature functions, but the other one actually is the underlying operating paradigm and basic business processes and workflows, things of that sort. Chances are they are not going to align all that well without further analysis between the existing organization and the future, more streamlined, more modernized environment. So custom systems are used in many large organizations, and there are times when that leads to competitive advantage or differentiation. And also there are times in government, for example, due to statutory changes and other things, there may not actually be a solution available in the marketplace, in which case a custom solution would have to be considered. Whether it's full custom or work that's based on COTS or transfer system with customization, the consideration of cost, of course, is of utmost importance, since after all, it is an investment. And the cost will have, the upfront capital investment plus ongoing support and maintenance related costs. So here's an example of the top 5 projects in the state of Oregon. They are quite large, some of them. Department of Human Services is doing a system to integrate eligibility determination for social services. That's a very big budget identified here, $335 million. That's based on a transfer system from the state of Kentucky with customization. Department of Justice is doing a system to deal with child support, and that's $130 million lifecycle costs. That's a transfer from the state of California. And then you have these other systems in transportation. That's for the Department of Motor Vehicle for managing driver's licenses of different types. That's a commercial off the shelf from a company that has done this for other states. Then you have the health authority doing health IT related type projects. It's a portfolio of 3 projects with a total cost of $28 million. And then you have the Department of Administrative Services doing a statewide human resource information system. So kind of one characteristics of these projects, as was mentioned in the last slide, is that they're based on a base system. And interesting aspects of that is that the minimal viable product that one can consider in a complex environment, the cost of that is going to be a significant portion of the overall budget because the cost of the base system is quite high. And, when people look at complexity of projects in a state environment, typically we view it from the point of view of the business complexity involved and the technology complexity. And for systems that are built around a base system, the business complexity, of course, is based on your current operating models and business processes and kind of what will end up to become the to-be business processes and operating paradigms. And then this matter of the base system that you're starting with and the target feature functions that may or may not require a great deal of customization. So back to this mentioning of the lifecycle costs, there are the capital costs associated with the prime contractor, which sometimes later on in this presentation, I'll refer to sometimes as the system integrator. The emphasis for our prime contractor in the enterprise project, it is partly software development, especially when custom code is involved, of course, but really a great deal of it is system integration that involve disparate systems. Some of them may be brought in by the vendors, and some of them would be the existing legacy system in the enterprise that must be integrated in order for a end-to-end solution to be created. We have possible capital costs associated with internal staff, of course, but also supporting contractors that I will talk a little bit more in a later slide, resources that it's needed by the internal organization to properly manage the project. Then, of course, not to be forgotten is chances are you're acquiring new hardware, new software licenses, creating new networking infrastructure, telecommunication circuits would need to be procured, stuff like that. The ongoing cost is, of course, the costs associated with operation and maintenance. And typically in a large organization, application support would likely be outsourced to the same contractor that developed and integrated your system. But there's going to be a level of internal support and maintenance with the infrastructure and networks and things like that. Not to be forgotten is whether it's in the private or public sector, being a major capital investment, there may be financing costs involved, and that's should be accounted as part of ongoing costs. For state government, it's not unusual we use a bonds or bond-like mechanism to fund major IT projects, and that debt services, which is basically the interest plus the principal that you have to pay back. I mean, those have to be budgeted over time. An area that's not looked at as much as direct costs is kind of the technical debt, due to workarounds because of non-optimal business functions and processes that's supported by the system. There may be non-optimal aspects of the architecture that makes it difficult to support and maintain, and I'll go into that a little bit. And then, of course, the defects that may not be discovered and may take a period of time before they can be fixed in a way that allow good production use. So scope of customization is an important aspect of major IT project, and feature and functions that's needed by the acquiring organization may not be in the base system, and certainly the interfaces and integration with existing legacy system that would have to be dealt with, as well as conversion of data in systems that are being replaced. The nature of the technical work, from an engineering standpoint, you're maybe using configuration tools, there may be scripting involved, and then of course custom code for new feature functions. But as was mentioned before, system integration a lot of time is the emphasis, and sometimes the prime contractors is simply referred to as the SI, the system integrator. So some important considerations is of course the cost and the time required to do some customization for a base system and the expected benefits. And that's where some challenges exist in an enterprise because the people involved sometimes may not have a clear view as to why the risk associated with customization may or may not be justified. And that's something you have to work with the vendor. And anytime you work with the vendor, this earlier point I made that really the vendor have different motivation than the acquiring organization. And then these challenges that has to do with support and maintenance, once you deviate from a base system through customization to meet your organization's specific and possibly unique requirements, you potentially have a ongoing support and maintenance challenge in that your code base is bifurcated from the main product that a company may be selling as a COTS package, and that then kind of place certain requirements around how you're going to do your upgrades and patching, and then the kind of technical environment you must have in order to support proper testing before you promote into production use. Okay, a bit of cautionary statements about requirements. this piece of graphics on the top here is supposed to connote what I consider the normal project management aspects of project management. Sounds like a redundant statement, but in normal projects, enterprise architecture, a dominant design, and a maturity model may well exist to guide you toward where you want to end up. And as a result, your business driver and your business case can be identified, and your business case may well be quite stable. Under these circumstances, the project triangle of balancing scope requirements, cost, and schedule is primarily driven by system engineering type considerations. However, for projects that involve significant paradigm changes, your to-be enterprise architecture and dominant design may not be there, and there may be no maturity model to guide you from where you are to where you want to end up. In these situations, your business case can be viewed as unstable, and the requirements are susceptible to organizational dynamics type consideration. Another way of saying that the politics can cause very volatile requirements. And in this type of situation, the project triangle is not purely based on system engineering, kind of an evolving organizational dynamics around just what is the future architecture is supposed to look like, and consequently, just what is the business case and that sort of considerations. So, this present. Yes.
I have a short question. I mean, the slide that you have up here says, agile or not, are requirements knowable? And just because it's a large organization and you have an RFP and you have requirement specifications and so on, does that mean that the requirements are known?
The requirements are known in a legal sense, and to the extent that they are described sometimes at a very high level, it presents a lot of room for interpretation.
Yeah.
And it's the room for interpretation that result in a kind of ambiguity that lead kind of the scope requirement to uncertainty. And anytime you have uncertainty, that result in risk. And one thing that's very common in UAT, and I'll mention that a little bit, is that an acquiring organization may see something as a defect or a bug, but the prime contractor or the system integrator may come back and say, there are no specific requirements like this, and our system meet the letter of the requirement in the contract, and that's a very common challenge for all projects. So maybe some of the later slides would help us deal with kind of these requirement volatility issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the sense in which, when it's very volatile, that's a sense of something isn't firmly knowable. And when something isn't firmly knowable, that's a significant risk for the project.
Right. Keep going. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's a good question. So let's say hypothetically we know the requirements are in fact knowable, that by virtue of what Agile advocates very well, tight coupling between stakeholders with the developer. Consensus, that's the term we use in government a lot. Consensus is finally reached as to what the requirements should look like. You use your process of the user stories with progressive elaboration toward a better understanding of different users, perhaps using persona and other techniques to help you fine-tune as to what the user expectations might be, and these expectations got translated well into statements of use cases, feature functions, and specific requirements. If that's done well, we could say, okay, now we can take that as a statement that we know the requirements. Then there's the other aspects of the requirements, which is, well, you know your requirements. They are now made precise, but are they accurate and reliable? You know, for those of us who have a training in science, there's a distinction between precision and accuracy. What we wish for is accurate requirement, not precise requirements, in the sense that they are firmly specified, but may well be off the bullseye. And so what are some of the reasons why requirements may turn out to be unreliable? Well, in a large organization, you need the involvement of the subject matter experts. And if the subject matter expert is all-knowing in terms of the necessary requirements, the typical challenge is that they may not be available when needed. And that turns out to be a real issue a lot of time, because they are vitally important for their business operations. And sometimes you don't get the best SMEs. Then there's other issue I mentioned earlier. You know, the SME by nature are experts of the SES business process. They may have a tendency to want the new system to enable them to do their current business processes. And in certain customization, that may end up being unnecessary complex software, as was kind of mentioned in the promotional material for this talk. That very much is a challenge of the trade-off between what is the cost of customization versus its benefits. And we hope the subject matter experts in the organization have a good feel for that. But that is a challenge, because when you bring in a new system that, in essence, assume new operating paradigm and a new workflow, your subject matter experts really are the vendors, the contractors that's bringing in the new system and have an understanding of what are the underlying operating paradigm and the to-be business processes. But of course, the party that ultimately decide whether the system meet requirements would be the acquiring organization, and that builds up a sort of challenge in objectivity, you know, because the business owners and even the subject matter experts of the business owners, they may have a certain view of how the organization should operate that may or may not be compatible with the new system and the mindset behind that new system. Last but not least is it's a matter of authority. You know, you expect your subject matter experts to work very closely with the vendor, the contractor, in a self-organized team, and that's great, and that may actually happen. But one would have to question whether the subject matter expert necessarily have the authority in potentially changing the roles and responsibility of staffs, and that turns out to not necessarily be the case in at least government contexts. In private sector organization, maybe there's kind of more room to enable and empower individuals to take on these type of responsibilities, and that would be a good thing. Okay, the next thing is organizational readiness. A project is going to require a lot of different expertise, and that's the reason you have an independent, that's the reason you have a system integrator or a prime contractor coming in. They're doing a range of activities. The traditional things that we have in mind, of course, is the system software development, system integration, ongoing support and maintenance, that sort of thing. But really, there are a whole bunch of related activities that end up being shared between the acquiring organization and the contractor, especially when it comes to business analysis, the workflow, conversion of data, and it's not uncommon that the contractor, quote unquote, expect clean data, and that quote unquote clean data become the responsibility of this acquiring organization to do. And that's not so easy in light of you may have shadow system in your organization, and also you may have a lot of duplicative records, data that requires significant effort to cleanse. So these become things that sometimes are just underestimated in terms of the effort required on the acquiring organization side. So this chart, kind of a internal organization versus the external organization kind of chart, highlight my points here. You have a prime contractor coming in. They may be bringing in a big team with their subcontractors. And once you start the project, it's going to be a fire hose of activities and materials that may need to be reviewed and confirmed, and meetings that may or may not have written records. And I think the internal team is crucially important, based on experience, that be supported with a range of resources that typically span project management, business analysis in terms of understanding the as-is versus a to-be workflow and operating paradigm, the system analysis in terms of whether the proposed customization makes sense and would work and can be supported in the long run. And then the testing effort. And this idea that, the contractor, especially a good, reputable contractor, would develop and deliver a good system, it is a best case scenario. I mean, we should, as I like to say, we need to trust but verify. And that's where testing comes in.
Well, you say quality and testing and verifying. And so a question came in from John, and John says, so how do you handle quality gates in Agile?
Well, that's a kind of a deep question in a way. I mean, how do you handle these questions that ultimately are kind of all-encompassing? Is like, what is the meaning of quality? I mean, you'd like to think that.
Well, the thing is that in Agile, everybody's supposed to be responsible for quality. So you have an iteration, and then when you get your workable software at the end of the iteration, that's supposed to be the gate, I guess. But maybe working in large projects or government projects is not quite the same.
It is a correct statement. It isn't quite the same, because I think because of accountability to public funds and things like that, what government would normally expect is you have an independent third party to come in to verify and validate a system. In state government, in this particular chart, this dotted line up above that say independent QA contractor, it is exactly that, a third party that is brought in that is not the acquiring organization and is not the system integrator or the prime contractor, and his role and responsibility is to assure that whether all the way along the way or at the end, ideally all the way along the way, because quality is to be assured based on a combination of reviewing the work products and the management processes. That's kind of the ISO 9000 kind of view of quality. So if you ask my personal opinion, I think quality should ultimately be determined in a way that assure that the product meet business needs, and of course is built in accordance with the specification. That's the classic differentiation between verification and validation. And this needs to be done in a way that's independent enough from the development organization. So, as I say, you trust but verify. Now, how do you bring about this logistically? That of course is the challenge of every development lifecycle. And the combination of time boxing and making sure that the contractor is required to deliver reviewable work products over time. That I think is the key. And if you can have additional level of objectivity, whether it's through peer review of the internal organization, or as government frequently require, a third-party independent quality assurance contractor, these are all methodology that one can employ to assure good quality. As to where to impose the gates, and in a time box kind of sense, I mean, that is something that I have additional slides to cover. So let's yeah.
Okay, we'll be patient.
Well, I'm going to talk about contracting model, and that would be a very good segue into assuring quality based on gates or pre-identified checkpoints, as I like to call them. Just a quick review, when you do a contract with the prime contractor, likely you're doing a contract based on a time and materials basis, which means hourly rates for different labor types, and then they bill you from time to time based on hours spent by the different labor categories. The state of Oregon and many public sector organizations prefer deliverable-based contracting. That means you have a fixed price or maximum not to exceed price for a range of deliverables, which together constitute the contract and what we're expecting to see from the contractors. These deliverable is not just the system itself, and typically include artifacts such as detail requirements, design documents, architecture documents, and things like that. Now, the whole idea of Agile, of course, is to streamline the documentation requirement. But with that said, it is crucially important for whatever is being done by the contractor to be visible and exposed to the acquiring organization. And if they have an independent third party that's mandated to review this stuff, then of course you got to have artifacts that's reviewable, because you can't monitor every moment of the work that is done in a range of teams working concurrently. And that is very much the challenge of Agile at scale, in a way, is how do you assure that inter-team and cross-functional collaboration and dependencies are managed properly. Increasingly common is probably like a hybrid type model, that your deliverables may well be time-boxed and enable kind of periodic review of the work that comes out of it. So where there's going to be a lot of challenge is the acceptance criteria. You may well have a lighter requirement around acceptance for what would be considered interim deliverables, but all said and done, when the system is finally delivered to you, there got to be well-defined criteria for the acquiring organization to say, well, this meets the requirement of the contracts, and that's a challenge both in project management, contract administration, and vendor relationship management. This is the slide probably John and others may be waiting for. I think the contracting model, if we're using iterative development methodology, we very much need to anticipate reviewable deliverables, if not every iteration, then every few iterations. If you have weekly sprints, maybe once a month, you should have, in the middle of this chart, what I call the iterfall scenario. Internally, one of our colleagues made up this term, which is intended to mean that you have iterations, but you have waterfall-like structures superimposed on top of that. And these waterfall-like structures anticipate that you have known developer, system integrator requirements going into one or more iterations. And then when you come out of it, you have testable code from the system integrator, but now the acquiring organization and or its third-party independent quality assurance contractor can hit the code, based on its own test scripts, and then identify the test, look at the test results and come up with its own understanding as to where the defects are and what is the risk of the project. So we don't take just the developer's words on what is the velocity and just what is the risk of being on time and on budget at the end. Unfortunately, in many organizations, the contracting model assume waterfall-like development lifecycle, even when agile and other iterative development methodology is used. And by that, I mean, if you look at the upper schematics, you have requirements going in, and at the end, you have testable code coming out, maybe as late as UAT. And along the way, you have important documents like the detail requirements that's been embellished to incorporate inputs from the user communities and the stakeholders. And then you have design documents and maybe architecture documents and things like that. I believe the worst case scenario tends to happen, based on my own observation in the state of Oregon, is that when such a contracting template or framework is used for the contracting, but the contractor is actually doing, the diagram below. That created incongruence between the contracting model and the actual development lifecycle, and it's in my opinion is not a good thing. It's a very confusing thing, and it could drive the contractor to do work that's in fact is more waterfall-like on the one hand, and if they do iterations and there's no ongoing verification and validation on the part of the acquiring organization, then it's equivalent to the top in practice, and that is not the goal of iterative development or agile. And I think that's something that many organizations that adopt agile would need to look at much more carefully, is how you're going to do the contracting that anticipate relevant deliverables to assure congruency between the development lifecycle and the contract deliverables. Okay, testing. Sometimes the acquiring organization may not have thought through what are the kind of testing it needs to do in order to assure what I call the trust but verify mindset. Especially in government setting, but also in private organization, you have to worry about accessibility by people that may be visually impaired, for example. There's, of course, security testing, which is top of mind for many CIOs, because security issues would give rise to very negative career impact. Then things that are sometimes not even budgeted or considered is data conversion. Like I say, a lot of contractors expect the acquiring organization to cleanse the data, and then that type of thing can't be last minute. It has to be budgeted and has to be thought through, not just the technical work, but the testing and the control points that you're going to introduce to make sure that you have good data conversion. Integration, of course, has to be tested. A large system is likely going to integrate to many legacy systems. This very large project I was mentioning earlier that has to do with eligibility determination for social services. There are many legacy systems, and then the count is upward of 20 that needs to be integrated with the new system being transferred in from another state, and that is introduce big challenges to end-to-end testing. And then people need to plan out the testing in such a way that is throughout the life cycle, I believe, that you can't just take the vendor's word that that system integration testing has gone well, and that sometimes people find that the vendor tell you the SIT testing, the system integration testing went well, but then when you finally expand the SIT testing to include the system that must be integrated, usually legacy systems, there are lots and lots of defects. So the way to think about testing is through formal entry-exit criteria, and here are some examples of kind of important exit-entry criteria for system integration testing, that's SIT testing, user acceptance testing, and then the thing you have to do doing pilot to assure that you can have a successful transition to enterprise-wide use. I won't belabor the details here, aside from saying that you like as few severity 1 and 2 defects as possible, 0. And then there got to be some kind of a empirical shape metrics. And by a shape metric, I mean basically the defect counts for running the same test cases with regression. And so, you ought to be able to see the defects to stabilize before you release these codes, because if not, probably you're asking for disaster. So to conclude, I think enterprise projects always need to manage a big range of complexity. Agile and other methodology may enable kind of increase user interactions and collaboration, and that's a good thing. But with that said, the challenges of all major enterprise projects, even if they use the techniques of Agile, is going to have to focus on how the different work teams, cross-functional teams, will be coordinated. The governance will be important. There needs to be good roadmap that guide, the efforts of the disparate teams working in different functions. The dependencies, in different functional areas is not something you can just imagine, especially in a highly regulated context of healthcare, utilities, and of course, government. I think the underlying view is that you can put a bunch of very well-meaning people together, and they work very conscientiously, but they are not going to come out with all the necessary requirements and regulations. And I think one technique that's been tried would be you have your user stories and user scenarios, but that got to be coupled with a healthy dose of the applicable standards, applicable regulations that that the work would need to comply with. One story I like to tell is that I was working with a local nonprofit, and they were funded by a big regional foundation to do a piece of work on managing health records. And they're very well-meaning people. They work very hard, but some of the regulation they simply don't know. And I saw in their log, comments such as, we call the Oregon Department of Human Services, and the person that answered the phone said this. You know what? That cannot be relied upon as the definitive confirmation that you have understood the regulatory requirements. Number one, you may not know who you're talking to. You may be just talking to a receptionist. So those are things to be concerned, because these are among the things that very much need to be verified and validated. regardless of the success in putting together the self-organized team, and regardless of how conscientious and how well-meaning everybody is. And this slide repeats some of the same comments. There are many facets for quality management. Contractors and the acquiring organization really have different motivations, and that needs to be kept in mind in a very fundamental way, that the contractor are driven by the profit motive. They want to deliver a software on time and profitably. And if there are things that can improve the system in terms of usability or in terms of meeting business need, and is not in the contract, chances are they're going to want more money, or they would simply refuse to do it. So the development lifecycle, including Agile and other iterative models, whereas they're important for quality, the most important takeaway from this talk, I think, is that they are kind of idealized worldview, and is necessary for the practitioner to balance that idealism with realistic expectation and pragmatism. Thank you very much. And we're now going to the question and answer period, and I turn the floor over to Phil.
Yeah, great. It's you've gone over a lot of information here, Ying. A couple questions did come in. One of them was related to the use of contractors, and the question was, do we need contractors in every area, like PM, business analysis, system acceptance testing, and so on, or just in testing, or just, one section, one part of it, or is it just kind of a mix and match according to whatever you need, I guess?
That is a good question. And if you look at this slide 17, part of the reason I use different colors, the yellow for what I consider the traditional things you expect a contractor to do, like developing the software, system integration, support and maintaining the system going forward, and the training doing the business transition. The white letters in these boxes, I think they ended up being shared responsibility in some way. And increasingly, the trend is for the contractor to also be doing some of that stuff, because the acquiring organization may not have sufficient business analysts to fully understand whether a proposed workflow may or may not meet business needs, especially in light of some of these environments that I was talking about that's highly regulatory driven. So the extent to which an organization would have proper internal resources, and that refers to this slide here. It's great if the organization have the internal team to support project management, business analysis, system analysis, and testing. But if not, given the volume of stuff that would need to happen, both in terms of in-person activities as well as potentially heads down review of contractor materials, work products including, then probably the internal team is going to have to staff up for its own internal organizations, and as well as determining where's the heavy lifting is going to occur. There's no one answer, but I think the trend is toward giving the prime contractor a lot of the work in elaborating the details of the requirements, subject to the approval of the acquiring organization, and then allow the contractor to, of course, manage his own internal team, but also assist you with the things that needs to be done when you transition to operations.
Would it be worthwhile to have a different contractor do certain things besides the testing? Because I could see possibly, for instance, business analysis having a different contractor, or
Absolutely.
Other roles, system analysis.
Absolutely. Yeah, this org chart anticipate different contractors working with the internal team.
Hmm.
Now, government contracting can be quite Byzantine, and I think the procurement people is going to prefer that you sign on with a larger firm that can provide uh, these different functions.
Well, it's
But
not
I made the
necessarily having a firm that's large enough to have that capability to provide the service. It's more in terms of also having independent input. Um,
yeah. So that's kind of the challenge is that the bigger teams, the bigger organization, they're going to want to be the boxes on the left hand side that's in red. They want to deliver the system because that's a lot more money. Um, these firms that provide the professional services to support the internal team, a lot of them are smaller firms, and that's one of the reasons it makes sense to have different firms. And I think testing is a specialty unto itself, and that's to be differentiated from these firms that are more management consulting and analysis in nature. And so probably it's going to be tough to convince your procurement folks in a state government context to say, let's procure 4 teams to support these 4 functional needs for the internal organization. But they would definitely entertain at least 2, because some of the largest projects, in fact, has more of like a management consulting firm that assists um, in some of the kind of the thinking and the review of the documents, and then have a separate testing contractor.
One more question here.
Okay.
The question is there an average duration you work with contractors, or does that depend on the project? I guess it would depend a lot on the size of the project and the phase. So, for instance, maybe
Yeah.
business analysis contractor maybe would work mostly in the beginning or something like that.
These mega projects that has budget, let's say over $100 million, they are always going to be multi-year. 4 to 5 years may be very optimistic, from the time that you have kind of get the initial funding to develop the business case internally, and you have navigate through a range of activities that get you your approval to move forward, both in terms of having an approved business case, but also in terms of the approved budget. Then, of course, for government, even for the private sector, you have to go through some process of procuring the contractor. And ideally, your procurement process will be supported by some framework of evaluating which contractor has the solution that's best fit for the needs of the organization and whatnot. And that's a bigger topic that needs to be covered at the conference.
Yeah, sure. I have one more question. This is kind of from me, and maybe you can kind of touch on some of the answer. But and we've had a lot of discussions about Agile and what it is and so on. And what's obvious to me here is that Agile, as it's practiced in a traditional sense, via Scrum and Kanban and so on, does not fit into this environment. But Agile, as we have discussed in previous conversations, is really just a set of principles, a set of values. And so I'm wondering and Scrum is an implementation of that. And so I'm wondering to myself, okay, so what would be the top things or the top principles in Agile that you could carry over into this environment and use in some way, but not necessarily implement it in the same exact way that, of course, it's implemented in Scrum or Kanban?
Yes, I think, back to this chart number 7 here, I think there is a sweet spot for Agile. And, if you read, books by, say, Capers Jones, who had a lot to say about analyzing software from the point of view of function points. His book, The Economics of Software Quality, actually have some very positive thing to say about Agile, and it looks at it from the point of view as a good way to prevent the potential of requirements defect. And I think most organization in major IT projects, the requirements is likely going to be a little bit volatile. And that is mostly probably because the people involved hasn't worked together enough, and it takes time for the requirements to mature and stabilize. That is to be contrasted with this other situation I was saying, that perhaps there are times when the requirements are fundamentally unknowable. And those of us that were involved with the rollout of the health insurance exchange for the different states under Obamacare, we know this very dark period when the guidance from the federal government on how the exchange would need to work from a business functional standpoint just weren't there. And it doesn't matter how well-meaning you are, those requirements just become very suspect and potentially, as I call it, unknowable. And those are the situations where, given the organization dynamics, and a term I haven't used in this talk is culture. And both organizational culture and national cultures are actually very important to how projects needs to be done. And I do think Agile, in its advocating of close interaction between contractors and stakeholders, is fundamentally very sound. What of course is a big challenge is whether the requirements are knowable and the subject matter experts are empowered and have the necessary skills or even access to relevant documents and requirements, things of that sort.
Right. We don't want you to spill all the beans there.
Yes.
Yankee, because I know that if you go to the last page, we're looking forward to your talk and your workshop, which will be on, I think your talk is going to be on the first day of the conference at about 10:40. So, and you're also giving a workshop, which is going to be really exciting also for, those that are in working in large enterprises, which is half a day to really dig deep into some of these questions and answers and so on. So we look forward to having you at PNSQC this year, both as a technical paper author and as a workshop leader. And I hope that it'll be, pretty hands-on and really giving participants quite a bit of opportunity to go through the kind of documents and understanding the kind of things that they really need to do when they're procuring with and working with contractors and going through requirements, like you just said, and really making these unknowns known. So thanks very much for your webinar today, to give us kind of a highlight of what's to come in October. Lastly, I just wanted to say that the webinar has been recorded. I did remember to push the record button, so we did record, and it will be put on the PNSQC YouTube channel. Thanks very much, Ying, for sharing your knowledge with us. One last thing, if you look at the bottom of this slide, so any of those that attended the webinar today will be able to get a discount using a Kwong webinar discount code in the promotional code box, and you'll be able to get the early bird discount, not the super early bird, but that's still very, very significant. I think it's $200-300 off. So we hope to see you on October 8th. And thank you very much, Ying and all the participants, and we'll hope to see you all soon.
Thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Have a nice day.
Okay, thank you.